Let's talk about the Planescape campaign setting by David Zeb Cook from 1994. This is the core box set of the Planescape setting for 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, inspiring perhaps most famously in wider culture Planescape Torment, the game. This is widely considered one of the best, most important of the box sets and settings of the era, along with Birthright. Lots of people really like that as well. So let's talk about it. There are inside, there's the lid, 3 books. I actually bought it second hand, a Planescape Conspectus, which was the sort of sales gumph, which actually you can buy for real money on eBay because they're kind of interesting. The same for the Dark Sun ones. There are 3 books. There is a pamphlet of a monstrous supplement, there is a DM screen, and there are 4 poster maps inside. So the peripherals first, the kind of 4 booklets we'll do proper discussions of. Yeah, DM screen is 4 panel. The inside has Planescape information, though my second-hand copy has pasted in normal DM screen things, which is kind of useful actually. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, it was a trend in the box sets, in many of them, to give you a DM screen, and I'm all for that, though even a 4-panel one, let alone the terrible 3-panel ones, the 4-panel ones still aren't that exciting, generally speaking, in terms of resilience or largeness. The Planescape early adventures also all came, the first 3 or 4 also came with a custom DM screen for the adventure, which is a really interesting decision. So the 4 peripherals, 3 of them on their obverse have maps, and one of them on its obverse has this sort of faction summary of pictures. I will try to get them on camera. We're not on PDF today. I'll try to get these on camera. This is the first one. Obviously, we're not going to get everything in shot, but just to give you a flavour. These are all, I think, by the same artist. Let's see if we can find him. Cartography, Rob Lazzaretti, yeah. So this one, which you can see starting there, this is the planes, the outer planes, and then at the top you've got the sort of prime material and inner planes. So that is an actually pretty useful, I would say, visualization and depiction of the way that a complicated universe, which has been changed here from, subtly in some ways, from its 1st edition version, how that works. The second map is, I won't unfold it fully, but is Sigil, the great city. It's quite bland from here because it's pretty brown, but it shows how the big donut ring of Sigil works and is useful again as a prop for you. Then there is a map of one of the planes in detail. This is the Outlands, formerly Concordant Opposition. This is where Sigil is. So again, you've got a useful, so you've got the big map, you've got the planar map of Concordant Opposition or the Outlands, and then you've got Sigil. And the final one is just these faction symbols. On the reverse, there are 2 of them are like this. They are big textual summaries of powers on planes and locations on planes, and that is to essentially save space elsewhere. They're fine, they're not really game material, they are just DM aids and average ones at that, it's probably fair to say. There is, the other 2 are kind of art inspiration ones. So here you've got 4 pictures. They're all grey though, so maybe that's, you know, for the 2 miserable places, that's good. For the 2 more cheerful places, I think one of these greyed out, slightly dystopic places is the home of Sheila Periroyal, that, you know, halfling god who you know, I think is important for food possibly. There is, however, again, this is going to be hard to get any kind of reasonable perspective on. This is a picture of Sigil, kind of this industrial, semi-dystopic mega city. So that's kind of fun, I think. That's one of the inspiration art pieces. Now, so I'd say those peripherals are decent. They are better than in many. Lots of poster maps you can't complain too much about, and they're not useless. There's still some sense. You're talking about 4 very big sheets, and of them, probably 3 or 4 sides feel wasted. So, on the other hand, it means you can have maps out side to side. The interior art is all by, famously all by, in this case, Tony Di Talizzi. The guy does art like that, for those who are wondering. Some of it's just line and shade, but there are colour pieces in a kind of watercolory style. He, after moving on from this, he became perhaps... Sorry, I'm having issues with keeping a new mic in any kind of reasonable position here. He became more famous latterly for doing Changeling, the Dreaming, which is where I first picked up on his art. He is definitional for Planescape in the way that in the way he was for Changeling, but in the way, say, Brom is for Dark Sun and Spelljammer and Deadlands. You know, it really is. Lots of the early books through the first 2/3 of the run had interior art by Di Talizzi, and so did, I think, some Dragon and Dungeon material as well. So the 3 books are a Player's Guide to the Planes, which is the intro book, a DM's Guide to the Planes, which is a sort of rule book, I guess, and then the big book, which is half of the page run, is Sigil and Beyond. So it's a kind of a gazetteer setting book, and it makes sense, I guess, as the way that would be set up, that it's split that way. The Player's Guide, you're told to start here, so this is where you start. This is for everyone, and there are 6 pages of the multiverse, informationally functional, but it's presented well. Cook's tone is different. It's not completely different to his tone elsewhere. You know, when you think about how he writes in the 2nd edition books, core books, there's a degree of his familiarity which comes out here as well, but even more so. And I mean, I'm not going to do any of the in-character chat, but just the kind of the way, the immediate use of this Planescape sigil cant, you know, the dialect of the planes, and the familiarity with which he addresses the players and DMs is an intentional tonal shift. Now, before stepping through any door, a body had better have a quick lesson in cosmology. How else is a basher going to know where and what things are? First, it's important to know just what a plane is. To the serious philosopher types, a plane's a world or a collection of worlds that operates according to its own particular laws, including those affecting magic, gravity, and even the morals of the plane. Those are pretty much the first words out of character to the reader in the book, and therefore in the whole box set. So the idea that this is a informational, discussional, familiar, informal perhaps presentation is there straight away. The biggest new thing is that concordant opposition, the true neutral plane, is now called the Outlands. At the centre of it is Sigil, ruled by the mysterious Lady of Pain. Sigil, I do have that. I'll get that picture that I got again. There we go. This is Sigil. You can see here, there's the big spike, at the top of which is a floating donut. The donut is the city of Sigil. The only ways in and out are through portals. The city is full of portals. It's called the City of Doors. So it's the centre of a planar concourse, basically. Then there are 3 or 4 pages about the inhabitants of the planes, and he uses 5 Ps. Primes, people from the prime material. Planars, people born on the planes. Petitioners, who are basically people who have died and are seeking their eternal reward according to the philosophy they live by in life. Proxies, who are those granted a deity or power's power. And powers, who are here not statable creatures. A power is not someone you fight. There's an interesting thing there that it's worth realising that's a genuine change in D&D, and it's not what 5th edition D&D does either. You can destroy Orcus or Lolth. If you can find them on their own plane, at least you can permanently destroy them. And the same thing goes on, you know, that's an assumption of Gygaxian D&D, that high-level characters are ultimately fighting gods. Here, that's not what happens. Powers are beyond comprehension. They're beyond measurement against. I suppose there might be some question of becoming a power, but that's about it, you know, and even that is not really compassed. Then there's some information, a few more pages about player character races and creation. And it tells you, you know, what's some very general comments about how classes might work and how they might interact with different factions. But the main thing in here is, very briefly, over 3 pages really, or 2.5 pages, 3 new character races: Barriors, Githzerai, and Tieflings. This is where Tieflings come from. Barriors are goat centaurs. Githzerai are a version of Gith who come from Limbo and are, in that sense, they are chaotic, neutral, monk types, but it's 2nd edition, so they're not monks. They can be fighter, wizard, thief. They particularly like being wizards or thieves for leveling ability. They have no priests. That's one thing, is these are all interestingly different. Tieflings have an interesting racial bonus package or ancestral bonus package. They get darkness 15 foot once per day, for instance. The Githzerai don't have priests. The Barriors have gendered class options because they're a more gendered society where the others aren't. They are distinct. Obviously, people are going to change that as they see fit. But in terms of the idea that the game benefits on the whole from restriction and limitation as opposed to from completely free-forming, I think it's good. It's the way I think about these things. It's my style, so it suits me. Then there are 16 pages of factions. The factions were always a significant component of the Planescape setting. The 16 philosophical factions of Sigil are generally envisioned to be employers or rivals for the PCs. They also represent arguably the key fluff that Cook creates for his planes, which is that belief creates existence at some level. This means bits of the planes can move around or mutate based on belief. So it's very Pratchettian, isn't it? That's a key thing, and the factions are one of his instruments, or maybe his key instrument for expressing that. These are people. He at one point calls them not philosophy clubs, but philosophers with clubs. The faction pages themselves are a general philosophical overview and faction info. That is 2 factions. They each get a page. You can see the general idea. You get a cool picture of one of them. You get some information under headings. They are explicitly cast as the equivalent of kits for planars, or at least sigilites. They've got benefits and drawbacks that you add to your character template. So they're kind of subclass, if you're thinking about an equivalent in other editions, and they are mostly really fun and interesting. They can technically be combined with kits too, particularly for those who come from the prime with a kit. They're mechanically less significant than kits, so the warping effect is restricted by that, so I think it's not a crazy idea. There's also eligibility, so believers of the source or the godsmen who think that everything is ascending to its fulfillment, its new point, if you will. The godsmen are open to all races, classes, and alignments. However, priests of specific deities suffer a -1 penalty on all saving throws for lack of utmost faith in their high-up man, because they think that there's something beyond. So did the Athar, who are they're kind of atheists, but they actually are more thinking there's some meaning and system beyond the gods that people worship. The godsmen, the believers of the source, their benefit is they are generally well received throughout the planes. They get a +2 or 10% bonus to all encounter reactions with planar beings. And restrictions. In addition to the restriction on priests mentioned above, they can't be raised or resurrected by any means. However, they can automatically be reincarnated as a player character race of the DM's choice. Maybe one more thing. The Doom Guard, who are very military, gain a +1 to attack with a sword. And those bashes normally denied. The use of swords can use one without penalty, but they have to abide by all other restrictions. So it's a way of a wizard using a sword without being a war wizard, as an example. But they are naturally resistant to healing and cures. They have to fail a saving throw versus magic to be healed or cured. So some of those are significant but limited. There's one thing they do compared to many kits where there's like several functions in each direction. And the factions are, if you're up for the basic idea, and I go back and forth, I basically do like them, but I think there is a way in which, I also wonder how far they are directly inspired by the early World of Darkness games, well, particularly, I'm thinking Werewolf and Vampire, where factional stuff is big. I mean, it is in all those early World of Darkness games, but still. Some of them are more interesting than others. Maybe ironically, here's a critique. The strong moral ambivalences of the factions place strangely with a heavy emphasis on alignment-based planes. As in, they're kind of a lawful good faction, but not really. It makes sense in terms of what we actually find in the world for many of us, and it makes sense for kind of how a factional game might play. But it's weird when you're like, no, there actually is a place of lawful good that is actually lawful good, and most of us would find preferable to chaotic evil. But there we are. They are mostly well done. It is the start of a very important thread in Planescape's history. It's not a big book, nonetheless. DM's Guide, 64 pages long. So that was 32, this is 64. 4 pages of overview, attempts to show the spin on the setting, the tonal shift, the scope of the planes, for instance, the tone of the planes. The tone is good campaigns have a flavour and feel all their own. Kryn of the Dragonlance saga has its epic struggle. Ravenloft is rich with brooding horror. Elminster's Forgotten Realms has the vast sprawl of ancient empires. Athos of the Dark Sun world reeks of gritty survival. And the tone is about ideas and philosophies about the meaning of the multiverse. It's meant to be strange and wonderful. And so that's the kind of the tone and setting. And this is the most explicit place, I think, where this is positioned as the tonal 2.5, not the rules 2.5, but the tonal 2.5. It's not the procedural exploration and combat of 1E. It's not the high fantasy standard of early 2E. But it's something moving into the developing mid-90s RPG standard, you know, pushing for edginess, for style. It doesn't set it up for the big metaplot stylings that were coming in World of Darkness and would come to a degree later in Planescape. There is an expectation you're still playing D&D with many of the traditional things, but respun. And I think it's here where it kind of makes the point that when you are, you know, you don't start in a kind of normal city. You start in this bizarre place, Planescape. You don't just do an adventure in a dungeon. You do it, well, this isn't the example, I think, but in a dead god's head, that sort of thing. The idea that the tone is weird and wonderful. There are then 18 pages of rules, which I'm not going to go through in much detail. It's fairly procedural, mostly it's clear. It's worth saying it's interesting and good that one thought that Cook had was the planes are different. They've always had some rules differences. How about we collate those on a single page, or a couple of pages? There's 2 tables related to it. That's how schools of magic are influenced by plane. For instance, that one. And we systematize what happens. It's a nice way of saying that places are different, that planes are different, and that's in a setting where exploration and novelty are big pools, big parts of the appeal. Maybe the one semi-unclear point to me is the power key stuff, which is ways of bypassing magical restrictions, but I worked it out, I think, on a reread. Then there's stuff about how magic items also work. Then there's guidance and rules on moving between the planes. Interestingly, Cook frames this as a DM control issue. How do you make, he says, a practical problem for every Planescape campaign is that of how characters will travel through the vast expanse of planes. But also, unless given limitations and guidance, player characters can travel anywhere in such a wilderness. And this isn't hyper-restrictive. The fact that he points out that it's a problem, one, he says it's going to be hard because if you don't give them ways of travelling, your players aren't going to go anywhere. But he also says, look, if you let them go anywhere, in the sense that they've got a full array of buttons, a full buffet from the off, well, there are difficulties that raises. Partly just needing to develop material for an infinite multiverse, which is literally impossible. But also the sort of expectations of giving them a way of learning about the world. There is a reason to have some structure material in campaigns, basically, isn't there? And he'll talk about this more in the 3rd book, and I'll talk about that then. But the world gradually opens up in any sandbox. It doesn't start completely sandboxy in the sense that you as the DM are always framing the early material. So you're giving the first rumours as an example. Players don't actually travel 400 miles away on day 1. The big secrets of the setting are earned through success, not through randomly picking places to go. Oh, well, you found out the biggest secret location of the entire setting. And the guidance on how connections between the planes is hard to visualize, but it gives the poster map. You know, he is also, that's one thing there, that the stuff about elemental vortices ways down into the inner planes, astral conduits ways into the astral sea. They are, they are maybe, and portals, they are maybe hard to visualize, but when you think about the big map, you can think, okay, so this is a route between these 2 places, imagined semi-abstractly on this map. discussions of the ethereal and astral, more good detailized art. And then we get to it's functional, I'd say, not terribly overwritten. Somehow I wanted it to be more overwritten, there to be more stuff on the rules. But yeah, then we get to the planes themselves, and this is roughly half the book, over half the book in fact. First you get the inner planes, then you get the outer planes. You don't get any big gazetteer on any one plane. The inner planes, you get a couple of pages or a page, and yeah, a page or a page and a half per elemental plane, half a page per para-elemental or quasi-elemental plane, and for the positive and negative energy planes too. Very slim on the inner planes. The outer planes, you get, there's a bit of an kind of overview of stuff to do with the outer planes, and then each outer plane gets a slightly fuller page than the inner planes got. You know, in terms of there are far fewer illustrations on those pages, more words. And so general observations, strengths and weaknesses, what works, what doesn't work. A page each obviously isn't much. It makes it hard to imagine running the planes. The information that is given is usually pretty solid, if perhaps formulaic. Some planes are more exciting than others. That's inevitable when you're detailing so many. But say Isgard and Gehenna both come across as challenging and fun. You know, Isgard is chaotic, good, neutral. It's Gladsheim as was now Isgard. And there are things like Muspelheim, a fire giant oriented place. In the middle of this chaotic, good, neutral place, you might need to travel there for some reason because you're working with the gods. You might need to go and see some Einherjar who are there, for instance. Or again, Acheron is, I think, is it lawful, neutral, evil, is a battle plane, and the visualization of the blocks of this layer being pitted and hollow, for one of the layers, there being a battle plane, all these layers drifting in a void of air that supports life and flight, and you know, this kind of weird place where you can see immediately lots of things that your players could be getting on with, at least on some of the layers. You know, that's fun, that's interesting. Whereas some are perhaps, you know, Arborea or Bartor are both ones that are quite light on gameables. None of these is going to have that many gameables. It's a page each, but you get my idea. So, for instance, Arborea just talks about, essentially, it's just all quite nice. There's some things about the caverns of Mount Olympus reaching to the lower planes that's interesting, but generally speaking, it's just the challenges are watch out for the huge funnel-like maelstroms that can sucker cut it into Elysium in the blink of an eye. That's not really a gameable, that's a random encounter. It's a gameable in the sense it could go on on a random encounter, or it could be perhaps the basis of something like, you have to somehow defend a Ossen town against it. But it's not as interesting as the idea that comes immediately to me of, okay, so the Viking gods are next to the giants who they're part of the same pantheon as, so they're going to have to interact. That's more interesting, basically. Bartor, similarly, despite Bartor in many ways being, I think, an interesting plane, here it's all pretty flat. It's just sometimes good descriptions, which, you know, you think, this is a rocky wasteland with a dark red and starless sky, though the landscape is lit by spheres that weave and flare into fire explosions. Good writing, nice picture to give your players, but there's not much there to it. And the inner planes and the parallel elemental planes and the quasi-elementals are in general even less obviously usable, partly because they are conceptual planes even more so. But there's sometimes a fun quirk or twist, particularly in the quasis. It'll describe a strange tower on the edge of the plane, which is maybe some kind of representative place for it, and its event horizon. I think that's interesting. The problem I would perhaps offer up there is, again, on these half-page descriptions, you're putting it all on the DM. It's not really mostly on the DM. You've given them a sentence, and some of us really want more. Some people are fine with that, but some of us really want more. We buy a product so it can help us do the work. This is both a super necessary section of this book, and it's one of the weaker sections of the box set. The planes are glossed over, The first adventure anthology, so that's Eternal Boundary and Well of Worlds, they both give some good early adventure concepts where you engage with other planes. So for instance, Eternal Boundary goes to a fortress on the plane of fire, and Well of Worlds ends up with a prime group going via Bartor, via Avernus to get to Sigil. But from this box set alone, you won't come away knowing the typical shape of a Planescape plane-hopping adventure, and that does seem like a failure, to me at least. You can't get everything in, I know, but there's something where you think, man, this is the Gazetteer of the Planes, and it's kind of just there. It's fine. The biggest thing, the final one of the big books, is this, Sidhu Beyond. It's very clear coming away from 96 pages that the box set best supports Sigil and the Outlands. This is something even observed about the whole line, where Sigil is the key locale, and you see it in the Planescape Torment game, where you go to the Outlands and stuff. Sigil all the more is the place, even more so than in other resources, it is where you're playing. Now, this book is actually a real mix of materials. It has 10 pages of DM advice. Obviously that's connected to the related section in the DM's guide. I wonder if they were originally written as one. There's a sense that perhaps it's been edited out to different books to make the page counts work. It has 37 or 38 pages of a guide to the Outlands, and then the remainder, nearly all of it, of 40 pages, or maybe 38 pages, is on Sigil, with a procedural and faction guide, and then a gazetteer. And then there's a bit of extra stuff to do with stuff happening in Sigil, getting your players to Sigil, and Sigil Cant as well, like the dialect of Sigil. So basically, Sigil and the Outlands respectively get a book longer than the player's guide overview book. And if it's good, it will represent a lot of value, and it is basically very good, I would say. It's very good in parts, and the whole of it is good as a product. The standout section of the box set is this, I think, of the 4 booklets and the peripherals. There's a section setting DM expectations, about what kind of campaigns you might run, how they might work. Again, you get stuff on theme. What's the typical theme here? Planescape campaigns about beliefs, ideas, philosophies, morals, and attitudes. There's the discussion of, well, look, it's actually fine. There's nothing wrong with this being a Gold and Glory campaign, it says, but it has to be something where the players don't see it as inventory, but as something magical and wonderful. These treasures are owned by things that have a better right to them than characters, and using wondrous magic simply as adventure bait cheapens its value to the campaign and the players. You need to do stuff that, and this is the next point, retains the wonder. So the Golden Glory campaign is fine, but it has to be one that is a wondrous Golden Glory campaign to best use the setting, in his view. Long-term objectives, stuff about factions, structuring a campaign. And then there is some genuinely useful advice that really tells you what Cook thought about the setting, when he talks about what to do with 1st to 3rd level adventurers, 4th to 7th, 8th to 10th, and then 11th. And here he talks about what suits different levels. So 1st to 3rd mostly in Sigil, 4th to 7th beginning to go around the Outlands, 8th to 10th. The DM doesn't have to create specific adventures, but just give hooks and ideas. And then 11th plus, the players are deciding everything really about what they're doing because they know enough. That's a really interesting, and that's not a bad way at all of sometimes envisioning a game. Even for us sandboxers, the idea that lower down earlier on, you're often saying, look, these are the kinds of things going on. What would you like to do? Whereas when players are getting higher level in a sandbox, they're often saying, I want to go and do this thing I've been planning for the last several months of real time. This is what I want to move on to. So they are driving it in a mid to high level game. And it shows Cook's intentions for the nature of a Planescape campaign in a way that is useful for thinking about why he's done other stuff. The fact there is less detail on the planes in the box set is because his assumption is that most games are going to be nearly entirely in Sigil and the Outlands, with just a dip into somewhere else. You're not often going to go to the planes. This is weird, and I think you can maybe say, so you're saying we go to one plane in this plane-hopping Planescape campaign, we go to one plane. And as I say, the adventure material that actually gets published does not do that. It pushes beyond very quickly, immediately in the first couple of products. It says, no, let's go to the planes. But you can see that Cook tries to ground this high-level adventure space with the low level area. And I wonder whether there's something there directly learned from Spelljammer, where Spelljammer is a mid to high level campaign setting. That was the first 2nd edition campaign setting in terms of like, this is a new thing for 2nd edition. And it really struggled, despite being an amazing idea of fantasy space travel, in my view, amazing. But it really struggled for a few reasons, just product issues, but also that it's kind of hard to know how to get the campaign going. You are basically assuming your characters were starting at 4th or 5th level, and you're assuming that you had kind of a big world to play in, which the products didn't immediately support. So I think here, and I've suggested elsewhere, I wrote in my blog, that the Rock of Braal is a good place to start a Spelljammer campaign as a 1st level campaign, where they are groundlings, but in space. They live on a planet, but it's one which is connected to spelljamming, and so they can very early go out into space as hirelings. They can very early get involved in some of the politics of the setting. And Cook is doing the same here, as far as I can tell, that he says you get them to dip their toes in via this contained space that is much more like a normal D&D campaign world in terms of its ambivalences and factions. So then there is an Outlands Overview after that, the lay of the land. This is a fairly simple summary of the realms and so the places where powers live. Semoania's Bog, the Palace of Judgment, the Mausoleum of Chronepsis, who is the dragon god of fate. Not something I think I would have known before reading this. There's also the discussion of petitions of the Outlands. Basically the fact that petitions of the Outland, being true neutral, want to retain balance, so sometimes they help and sometimes they won't, because petitioners are trying to achieve their nirvana with their plane, their oneness with their plane. Then discussion about magic, and then about spell keys, again for the Outlands, not for the whole planes, but for the Outlands. And this makes some of it maybe a bit clearer about what you need to do. So to distance distortion. To tap the power of the plane of Earth, the caster has got to memorise a gust of wind or similar spell. When distance distortion is cast, the gust of wind instantly vanishes from memory as if cast. So you memorise an air spell, so you can use earth spells. So in terms of how you bypass the magical effects, it gives you specific spell and power keys. And that's really useful. It's only inspirational, it's not an exhaustive list, but good idea, very useful. Then there's a really solid, lengthy section on Outland, towns, and some realms. These are a selection. The towns are gate towns next to the planes. They are a starter-level way of interacting with the planes. They're modelled as such. And it's not exhaustive, but they each get a couple of pages. The realms tend to be, I think, less interesting than the towns. And they tend to be slightly shorter, but not always. And it's kind of fun, you know, the Illithid god Ilson 9 lives here at the heart with kind of tentacle riven caves, and you might lose your mind, but you go there to get knowledge. That's okay. Similarly, Shekinesta, the Queen of the Nagas, there's some details about the kinds of tests you might have to face, so you can talk to the Naga goddess to get knowledge. But the towns are more interactive. They are places you'd actually go to do stuff. I mean, I say that there is a Dwarven realm, which is kind of a place where it's a settlement, but it's highly stereotyped intentionally. It's highly stylized. Whereas the town's Cursed is Carceria, I think, the prison plane, and Lawful Evil. And yeah, it's quite fun. There's the kind of several NPCs and a few locations put here. For instance, in Cursed, there is the Quartered Man, an alehouse where you can hire mercenaries. There's Brassicles, a dingy shop which specialises in traps and infernal devices. And the Selene brothers make heart wine, which is made from razor vine, the awful, mostly useless plant that grows here and is the only native plant, more or less. Or at least in Sigil it is. And so yeah, you've got a few locations there. You've got local news. Baron Zarnthasker's hit upon a new scheme for his return to the Prime Material, and he's looking to gather people for it. Again, to go to another town, because the realms don't have these local news bits. Bedlam, which is at the gate to Pandemonium. No matter what's really happening, there's always rumours of another invasion from Pandemonium. This time it's true. A band of fiends, 12 Geheres, led by a minor Tanari captain, are planning a flanking attack on the Batezu in the Blood Wall. The scheme is to seize Bedlam and then march across the Outlands to Bartor. It's not a very good idea, but the Tanari were never the best at plotting strategy. So there's just a thing to do. Basically, rumours, immediate gameables. Your players go somewhere or are told about something and they go there and sort it out or do whatever they want to do with it. And those both are decent little ideas, aren't they? I think those are both usable straight up. Plague Mortars, the Abyss. There are mercenary primes called the Illuminated who are harassing people. The Illuminated, I think, are the same people who turn up later in the Eternal Boundary adventure. So the idea there is a town faction thing going on. Ribcage is the Bartor one, and that is actually really long. It's like 3 pages. Local news. There's another factional challenge. Chaos, which is the Limbo Chaotic Neutral one, which is, yep, pretty confusing intentionally. This is one thing. These things are heavily stylized. You've got to sometimes, translate bits here. Let's see if I can get that. You can see that it's just random jumbled words. And the idea that, he's trying to communicate the flavour to you, isn't he, in doing so. But yeah, here they're building a wall of chaos, and when they're done, nobody able to come or go. Chaos will be theirs. They slip through after nightfall carrying a little more chaos stuff with them. There's things in your dreams that'll hurt you. I didn't sleep well last night. Slada building a wall down near the gate in the dark. The weather's nice today. And then 4 infinity signs. Is that real? Is it something that's happening? Well, it's the kind of thing that could come up while you're there. So these are, I think, really good. And one of my favourite things in the box set. These towns are well developed, and they... Losing my microphone, I'm worried that's going to be really muffled now. They're really interesting, really varied, and you get a few more towns detailed in some of the other products. It's maybe a shame that that wasn't a supplement in itself, a good supplement that had all of the towns. The players primer to the Outlands, I think, had a bit more of that, but not a complete selection. Then there is an equally long section on Sigil, which, as we've seen, is Cook's idea of a low-level campaign. There's a lot of overview sections, sections on portals, on gate keys, the mazes, Razorvine, the Lady of Pain. There's some mechanical info in those, but there's not very much. All workable, all interesting, particularly on practical ways to use portals. And that's the real planar selling point of Sigil, is there's a portal to everywhere. Now, it also gives faction functions. The 16 factions each have jobs, and these are like medieval guilds. The governors do the law courts. For instance, the sign of one run the parliament, because they guarantee that everyone gets to pretend to be the centre of the universe. Bum bum. And then there are a few major NPCs, humans who, unlike the Lady of Pain, you might actually interact with. There's Erin Darkflame Montgomery and Duke Rowan Darkwood, and I think Rowan Darkwood had turned up in Greyhawk Treasures, the adventure book. These threads are eventually resolved in Faction War, which I think is sometimes controversial. I mean, lots of people really love it. I think there are some drastic things it does with the setting, which you may or may not like. But that was setting up Planescape 2.0, basically. And then there is the best bit, or at least the most important bit, I think, of the Sigil guide, which is Sigil without a guide. There's tone notes again. So, for instance, there aren't things like banks with security vaults or travel agents who arrange tickets and reservations for a Burke's expedition out to the plains. When the player character wants several things, they've got to do a little legwork. Don't drag it out, but just remind them when their characters are gathering equipment, they're going to 5, 6, 7, 8 or 10 different stalls in the Great Bazaar. Don't treat magical items like machinery. This is a fantasy game, so it's got magic, but it's got to feel magical. Avoid cuteness. Be inconveniently convenient. They can find everything, but at a price. Good tone notes. This is, again, much better than lots of things, and it's quite short. Though this is not a short book, there's about 200 pages if you're putting it into one book. It's not a short setting book. It is nonetheless, when it wants to be, quite terse and direct, and that's a virtue. Particularly because where it's not terse and direct, you end up thinking, man, I'm confused about what's happening. There are notes on people you can meet. Touts, factotums, harmonium patrols, light boys. there are places you can go, taverns, stables, marketplaces, etc. And it gives you different types and styles of place you might be able to go that are like that. And then it gives you the 6 wards, and these are the main places in Sigil, the kind of regions in Sigil. And it gives a summary of them. It also talks about the faction headquarters that are located in each, plus a few key shops or locations in each, taverns or whatever. And it has a really nice conceit that the faction headquarter that your players might most readily associate with or get dragged into even if they don't join, you detail a couple of inns, and it says, yeah, clustered in the block around each headquarters. A cust is going to find taverns, inns, markets and shops. Always include at least 2 taverns, 2 inns, a stable, and at least 1 market that sells goods found on standard equipment lists. And there'll be some permanent portals there too. So it basically says, look, detail a neighbourhood. And that's actually never a bad idea for a city game, is that you try to focus your players early game, learning the ropes, engaging with the world on one small area. In the wilderness locale, you have the village. In the city, you have the neighbourhood, rather than, oh, well, where do you want to go in the city today? You give your players knowledge of one place rather than every place. That's good. Basic overviews of each ward, that's fine. Each faction headquarters, they're fine. Few specific locales, which I think I quite liked on the whole. So, for instance, in the lower ward, the Styx Oarsman is run by an emaciated and scarred Githzerai with one arm frozen into a claw-like pose. It's outright dark with a single candle, and you can go and talk to fiends. There's also the faction headquarter of the Athar in a shattered temple with a kind of cursed area around it no one can live in, but then there's markets around the edge because that's where, you know, people are like, people are going to treasure seek in the shattered temple area. It's a tourist attraction. We can't go in there to live, at least, but we can sell stuff on the edge. The Hive, the Clerks Ward, there's also the Ladies Ward, which I think I've skipped over. The Clerks Ward has the Green Gauge, a tiny little cider shop known as the Green Gauge. And also in the Clerks Ward, Grundletham's Automatic Scribe, which is disappointingly a human rather than a gnome, has created a dictaphone typewriter combo, I think. So that's interesting, and it gives that, and it's a gameable. It's a hook you can engage with and create an adventure with very easily, I think. And yeah, so there are two. There's maybe a couple of things to critique here. I like it; it's very good. There aren't many adventure hooks. The actual locales and caption info is really strong. Some of it is gameable. You can imagine throwing it into a session and running with it and improvising with it. But it's a weird omission that you don't have the local news equivalent you have for the towns. There are, however, 2 very short adventure outlines to start a campaign, and that is how I think they're called campaign starters, campaign quick starts, for the price of a rose and misplaced spirit. So for the price of a rose, you're on the prime material, you're hired by a lady a noble lady who keeps finding her flowers basically damaged, and people are obviously coming in and out, and they're dumping roses that aren't hers and they're cutting roses that are hers. What's going on? Well, it turns out those are portal keys for a gang of thieves from Sigil who want to come and rob the prime, and this is what they do. That's a really clever idea. It's a really rich and fruitful idea. The one thing for the price of a rose is, and it gives some ideas about, okay, well, the thieves might be rivals in the future. You could meet a barrier called Stronghoof who could become your friend, ally, and guide. So it gives you really good basic information, but it's probably a session's play or less. In terms of adventure, it's not a full adventure, it's a couple of hours play. Misplaced Spirit is a petitioner from the Chinese mythos, a petitioner who had been going to the court of Yang Wang Ye for judgment, has escaped and doesn't want to go back. That's a really cool idea. There's some ideas about how this could work. There's future complications, how factions might interact. There's something to compliment Cook for, that he manages to give 2 adventure outlines which are basically better than lots of actual 32-page adventures. The one thing about these seeds, they're not even outlines really, they're seeds. One is really short and the other, though it could be multi-session, is really vague. They're about the same length, and so one details enough for a session but you need to fill in, and the other one details not even enough for that really because there's so much going on. And again, it's strange because they're really good, but you leave the DM with a lot of legwork. and these don't feel like a waste of space or vestigial, but they do feel underdeveloped given the lack of sigil hooks. Essentially, there is a sense that you're given a lot of ideas and then left to run, which some people will like, rather than really told, look, these are some good ways to start a Planescape campaign. Here's a way just to get going. And compared to other box sets, so for instance, the Birthright Core has, well, I'll get to that actually in my summary. Some of these things compare favourably to other D&D box sets of the second edition era. Some compare less well. Finally, there's the Monstrous Supplement. So basically, to run Planescape for monsters, you need either MC8, the Monstrous Compendium for the Outer Planes, which reintroduced Bartezu and Tanari, Devils and Demons, or you need, that's collated into Planescape Compendium 1, Planescape Monstrous Compendium 1. This is an add-on, some of which I think does go into Planescape MC1 anyway, possibly, I'm not sure, but it has a few monsters. It is 32 pages, so it's not short, but nonetheless, there's not loads and loads and loads here. It has the Cranium Rat, little intelligent, super-brained rats, and the Darbus, the servant race or whatever, or creature of the Lady of Pain, who speak in visible iconography, which no one understands. You'll know them from the video game if you've played it. They're fun, they're really good. The general tone is also good. There's no doubt that Darbus have a role in Sigil. They are its cells, constantly repairing the body of the city, for instance. Or from Magman, I'm kind of flicking at random here, this is just the next page. Upon occasion, a wizard will summon a Magman to fire a furnace for a magical procedure, but wise wizards return the little troublemakers as soon as the need has passed. That's gameable. Minions of Set. Modrons are reintroduced here, and Dita Litzy does good Modron art, I think. It's not a massive supplement or anything, but it's useful. It's also free. Another nice piece of Dita Litzy art. Nick Epona, the offspring of Epona, magical horse people. Conclusion. Let's conclude this. This isn't an adventure, but a setting box set, and so our expectations have to be set accordingly. They have to be altered. This is giving us big ideas, it's giving us rules superstructure, it's giving us an overview of the setting. On the whole, this is one of the best box sets D&D ever produced for that, including, I think, third party. It handles a lot of new and unusual concepts really well. It speaks directly to the DM about running a game, and it gives really good advice about how to set the tone and what's different about a Planescape game. It has some really, really just good individual sections. It's more immediately gameable in some ways, and some areas like the Outlands Gazetteer, than, say, the Greyhawk box set, or even Dark Sun. Dark Sun has an adventure in it, which I'll mention in a second, but I'm talking about the main setting information. There's just more stuff where you're like, oh, I'll drag that in, and immediately can create rumour tables or starting adventure seeds. It's justly considered one of the best. But Greyhawk and Forgotten Realms First both give better, higher level gazetteers, arguably. This struggles with scale, I think, that sometimes Cook is giving too much information and sometimes much too little for the same thing. Sometimes he's caught between the two. He's particularly weak on the planes themselves. And of course he conceived of Sigil and the Outlands being the low-level place, but that's a hard sell in some ways because this is a plane-hopping adventure setting. And you can see that low-level adventures tended to bypass that and give PCs access to the planes from the off, and that was the right solution for that. The players have come to explore the planes, give them the planes. It's more fun that way. It's also right to call out the lack of directly gameable material in terms of adventures. I don't mean a rumour, but in terms of here's an adventure. FR First and Dark Sun both have full adventures in them. FR First actually has 2 dungeons, and Dark Sun has 1 adventure. That is not necessarily... It's an interesting adventure. I will talk about it sometime, but it's not a great adventure. Birthright has, I think, 3 outlines, and they're slightly longer in each case for how you can get into stuff from memory. Or at least it has I think it has 1 full outline, actually, 1 adventure and a couple of kind of adventure seeds. And you really want, therefore, Well of Worlds or Modron March or Eternal Boundary to go with this. If you're thinking, I want pre-published material to start, I want a few easy ins you're going to need probably to buy something else to go with this rather than just rely on the box set. Obviously, now with PDFs off DM's Guild, it's a lot easier to get that material. Nevertheless, it's an all-time great product. It is, yeah, one of my favourite box sets, I think. It's perhaps a harbinger of the underrated revival of TSR in the mid-90s, because I say that because from 1989 to 94 or so, yeah, you have Spelldrummer and Dark Sun. They're both quite troubled product lines. Dark Sun kind of pulls it out eventually, but they both struggle. Whereas from 94, you get Planescape, Birthright the next year, you get Bruce Cordell coming. You get a, generally speaking, far higher level of quality in that back end of second edition to the front end in terms of new setting and new adventure material. But anyway, what do you think of Planescape? What are your favourite settings? What do you think of the box set particularly? And what are your favourite accessories to it? Tell me in the comments. Till next time.